The morning Dr. Richard Hayes called my name, I knew my career was over. 3 years ago, I walked into the Oregon State Psychology Licensing Board hearing as Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a respected trauma therapist with a spotless record. I walked out as a disgraced professional, my license stripped away based on allegations I knew were fabricated. They said I had illegally recorded patient sessions. They said I violated the sacred trust between therapist and client. They said I was unfit to practice. What they didn't know was that I had discovered something much worse. What they didn't realize was that their desperate attempt to silence me would backfire in ways they could never imagine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Because sometimes when they try to bury you, they don't realize they're planting seeds. Today, 3 years later, I'm walking back into that same Morrison Building in downtown Portland. But this time they're the ones who need me. This time they're begging for help from the very person they destroyed. And they have absolutely no idea that the solution to their biggest crisis is sitting right in front of them. The 15th floor of the Morrison Building had always felt like a courthouse to me, all polished marble and intimidating silence. The Oregon State Psychology Licensing Board's annual policy summit was supposed to be a celebration of progress in mental health services across the state. Instead, the atmosphere felt heavy with desperation. Budget cuts had crippled public mental health programs. Suicide rates were climbing. The opioid crisis had created a tsunami of trauma cases that the existing system couldn't handle. I adjusted the strap of my leather portfolio and smoothed the charcoal blazer I'd chosen specifically for this moment. Professional but not subservient. Confident but not arrogant. The woman they had broken 3 years ago would have been nervous walking these halls again. The woman I had become was simply focused. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the Willamette River winding through the city. The same view I'd stared at during my disciplinary hearing while Dr. Hayes methodically dismantled my reputation. Back then, I was 31 years old, fresh from completing my postdoctoral fellowship in trauma therapy, passionate about helping veterans and abuse survivors heal from their deepest wounds. I had believed that truth and good intentions were enough protection in a profession built on trust and ethics. I had been so naive. The conference room doors were already open when I arrived, revealing the familiar faces that had haunted my nightmares for months after the hearing. Dr. Richard Hayes sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, his silver hair perfectly styled, his expression carrying the same dismissive authority that had crushed my appeals 3 years ago. To his right, Dr. Amanda Foster leafed through what looked like budget reports, her designer glasses reflecting the morning light streaming through the windows. Dr. Michael Torres was typing furiously on his laptop, probably responding to emails from the university department he ran with an iron fist. Jessica Chen, the board's chief investigator, occupied her usual seat near the wall, a tablet balanced on her lap and a slight frown creasing her forehead. She had been the one to interview my former colleagues, the one to collect the alleged evidence of my misconduct, the one who had presented the case that destroyed everything I had worked for. What none of them knew was that Jessica had reached out to me 6 months ago, privately, quietly, because she had started to notice patterns in the board's decisions that didn't make sense. Because she had begun to question whether the evidence against me had been as solid as they had claimed. Because she had discovered that sometimes the people tasked with protecting professional ethics are the ones violating them most egregiously. Dr. Hayes was mid-sentence when I appeared in the doorway, discussing the state's new mental health initiative that would require innovative treatment protocols for trauma victims. His voice faltered for just a moment when he saw me, a barely perceptible pause that I caught because I had been waiting 3 years to see that flicker of uncertainty cross his face. "Sarah," he said, recovering his composure with practiced ease. "This is unexpected. Are you here about your license appeal? Because I thought we made our position clear during your last filing." I walked into the room with measured steps, my heels clicking against the polished floor in a steady rhythm that seemed to fill the sudden silence. Foster looked up from her papers, her eyes narrowing as she recognized me. Dr. Torres stopped typing entirely, his hands frozen above his keyboard, as if I were some ghost from their collective past that had suddenly materialized to disrupt their carefully ordered world. "Actually, Dr. Hayes," I said, setting my portfolio on the conference table with deliberate care. "I'm here about the Pacific Northwest Trauma Research Institute. Your office requested a consultation regarding the state's new treatment protocols." The silence that followed was delicious. I watched as confusion rippled across their faces, saw Dr. Foster exchange a quick glance with Dr. Torres, noticed how Jessica Chen's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around her tablet. They had been expecting to meet with the mysterious research team that had developed the breakthrough trauma treatment methods the state was desperate to implement. They had been anticipating a presentation from the experts whose innovative protocols had caught the attention of federal funding agencies and mental health organizations across the country. They had not been expecting me. Dr. Hayes cleared his throat, the sound harsh in the continued silence. I'm not sure I understand. The Pacific Northwest Trauma Research Institute was supposed to send their lead researcher for today's presentation. We've been corresponding with them for months about their groundbreaking work. I smiled, the expression feeling both foreign and perfectly natural on my face. You have been corresponding with them, and you're looking at her. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Dr. Foster's papers slipped from her hands, scattering across the table in a whisper of movement that seemed unnaturally loud. Dr. Torres leaned back in his chair as if physical distance could help him process what I had just said. Jessica Chen was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between admiration and concern. But it was Dr. Hayes who spoke first, his voice carrying the same authoritative dismissal that had ended my career 3 years ago. That's impossible. We conducted thorough background checks on the Research Institute. The lead researcher has impeccable credentials and no disciplinary actions on record. You're absolutely right, I replied, opening my portfolio and removing a folder thick with documentation. The lead researcher does have impeccable credentials. Doctoral degree in clinical psychology from the University of Oregon. Postdoctoral fellowship in trauma therapy at Johns Hopkins. 3 years of intensive research experience developing innovative treatment protocols.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
And you're correct about the disciplinary record as well, Dr. Hayes, because the researcher has never actually committed any ethical violations. I let that statement settle over the room like dust after an explosion. The implication was clear, hanging in the air between us with all the weight of unspoken accusations and long-buried truths. Dr. Foster was the first to break, her voice sharp with the kind of defensive anger that springs from guilt. What exactly are you suggesting, Dr. Mitchell? Because if you're implying that the board acted improperly in your case, I should remind you that we followed all proper procedures. The evidence against you was overwhelming. I had dreamed of this moment for 3 years. In the darkest nights after my license was revoked, when I lay awake wondering if I would ever practice therapy again, I had imagined what it would feel like to face them with the truth. I had pictured their faces when they realized what they had done, when they understood the magnitude of their mistake. But I had never imagined it would feel this calm, this controlled, this perfectly orchestrated. The evidence, I said, pulling a tablet from my portfolio and connecting it to the room's presentation system, is exactly what I want to discuss today. The screen behind me flickered to life, displaying the Pacific Northwest Trauma Research Institute's logo and mission statement. Below that, a detailed breakdown of our research findings, federal funding acquisitions and the innovative treatment protocols that had revolutionized trauma therapy across the Pacific Northwest. The numbers were impressive by any measure, representing 3 years of relentless work and groundbreaking discoveries that had emerged from the ashes of my destroyed career. Over the past 3 years, I continued, my voice steady and professional, the Pacific Northwest Trauma Research Institute has developed treatment protocols that have reduced PTSD symptoms in veterans by 47%. We've created intervention strategies that have decreased suicide rates among abuse survivors by 33%. We've secured $2.8 million in federal research funding and have trained over 600 mental health professionals across Oregon, Washington, and California. Dr. Torres found his voice first, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. You're saying you built all of this after your license was revoked. I'm saying I built all of this because my license was revoked, I corrected, advancing to the next slide. When you destroy someone's life based on fabricated evidence, Dr. Torres, you force them to rebuild from scratch. And sometimes when you rebuild from scratch, you create something much more powerful than what existed before. The next slide displayed a detailed timeline of my work over the past 3 years. The months I had spent in exile from traditional practice, developing new therapeutic approaches that didn't require the state license that had been stolen from me. The corporate structure I had built that allowed me to conduct research and training without falling under the board's direct jurisdiction. The partnerships I had forged with federal agencies and academic institutions that valued innovation over political protection. But it was the final section of the timeline that made Dr. Hayes's face go pale. The dates and documentation of my investigation into the board's practices. The evidence I had gathered of systematic corruption, falsified reports, and ethical violations that made my alleged infractions look like minor oversights. Jessica Chen was leaning forward in her chair now, her tablet forgotten as she stared at the screen. She knew what was coming because she had been the one to provide me with much of the evidence. She had been the one to finally acknowledge that something was deeply wrong with the way the board operated. She had been the one to risk her own career to help me uncover the truth. 3 years ago, I said, my voice taking on a harder edge, I was accused of illegally recording patient sessions. The accusation came from Dr. Hayes after I questioned certain billing irregularities I had observed at Riverside Mental Health Center. The evidence against me was presented by this board as clear and convincing. My license was revoked, my reputation destroyed, and my career effectively ended. I clicked to the next slide, revealing documented proof of Dr. Hayes's billing fraud. Sessions billed to insurance companies that had never taken place. Patients charged for services they had never received. A systematic pattern of financial exploitation that had netted him hundreds of thousands of dollars over several years. What I discovered during my investigation, I continued, was that the recordings in question had been fabricated. Audio files had been created using artificial intelligence technology and presented as evidence of my misconduct. The technology used was sophisticated enough to fool initial analysis, but crude enough to be exposed under proper forensic examination. Dr. Hayes shot to his feet, his face flushed with anger and panic. This is outrageous. You can't come in here and make these kinds of accusations without proof. You're absolutely right, I replied calmly, clicking to display the forensic audio analysis reports. I can't make accusations without proof. That's why I've spent 3 years gathering it. The room erupted in chaos. Dr. Foster was demanding to see my credentials for conducting such an investigation. Dr. Torres was threatening legal action. Dr. Hayes was insisting that the board would never tolerate this kind of attack on their integrity. Through it all, Jessica Chen sat silently, her eyes moving between the evidence on screen and the faces of her colleagues as they scrambled to mount a defense against irrefutable facts. I remained standing at the front of the room, waiting for the noise to die down. When it finally did, I spoke into the silence with the kind of quiet authority that can only come from absolute certainty. The Pacific Northwest Trauma Research Institute has been approached by the Oregon State Mental Health Division to implement our protocols statewide. The federal government has offered an additional $4 million in funding to expand our research. The University of Oregon has invited us to establish a permanent research center on their campus. I paused, letting the weight of those achievements settle over the room. All of these opportunities require partnership with the state licensing board. All of them require your approval and cooperation. All of them represent the kind of innovative progress that could revolutionize mental health treatment not just in Oregon but across the country. The implications were clear. They needed me now more than they had ever needed to destroy me. The woman they had tried to erase from their profession had become the only person who could save it. The evidence of their corruption was documented and irrefutable, but I was offering them a path forward that could benefit everyone involved. Dr. Hayes sank back into his chair, the fight gone out of him as the full scope of his situation became clear. Dr. Foster was staring at the financial projections on screen, her business mind clearly calculating the value of what I was offering against the cost of continuing to cover up their mistakes. Dr. Torres was typing again, but his movements were frantic now, probably researching legal options that we all knew didn't exist. What do you want? Dr. Hayes asked finally, his voice barely audible. I smiled again, but this time there was no warmth in the expression. I want my license reinstated with a full public apology. I want an independent investigation into the board's practices over the past 5 years. I want ethical oversight implemented to prevent this kind of corruption from happening again. I clicked to the final slide, revealing the 2 paths forward, and I want a decision today. Because the federal government is announcing the expansion of trauma research funding tomorrow, and they need to know whether Oregon will be part of the initiative. The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't confusion or shock. It was the quiet desperation of people who finally understood that their survival depended on the person they had tried to destroy. The morning light streaming through the windows seemed brighter now, illuminating the faces of 4 people who were beginning to grasp the full scope of their mistake. Jessica Chen was the first to speak, her voice clear and steady. "I think Dr. Mitchell's proposal deserves serious consideration. The evidence she's presented raises significant questions about our past decisions, and the opportunities she's offering could benefit mental health services throughout the state." Dr. Torres looked up from his laptop, his expression grim. "The legal ramifications of this situation are extensive. If even half of what Dr. Mitchell is claiming can be substantiated, we're looking at potential criminal charges, civil lawsuits, and the complete destruction of this board's credibility." Dr. Foster was nodding slowly, her business instincts clearly warring with her desire for self-preservation. "The financial benefits of partnership with the Pacific Northwest Trauma Research Institute are undeniable. The federal funding alone would transform our capacity to provide services." All eyes turned to Dr. Hayes, who sat at the head of the table looking older than he had when I walked into the room. The man who had wielded absolute authority over my professional fate 3 years ago was now faced with the consequences of his abuse of that power. "How long do we have to decide?" he asked quietly. I checked my watch, a gesture that was probably unnecessary but felt appropriately dramatic. "The federal announcement is scheduled for 10 a.m. I need your answer by close of business today." I gathered my materials and closed my portfolio, preparing to leave them with the weight of their decision. But before I reached the door, I turned back to face the table one more time. 3 years ago, you told me I was unfit to practice psychology. You said I had violated the sacred trust between therapist and client. You said I didn't have the character necessary to help people heal from trauma. I met each of their eyes in turn, seeing my own reflection in their fear and uncertainty. What you actually did was force me to become better than I ever would have been under your system. You made me rebuild my career on a foundation of integrity and innovation instead of politics and protection. You turned me into exactly the kind of therapist this profession needs. The elevator doors closed behind me with a soft whisper, carrying me away from the scene of my destruction and toward a future I had built from its wreckage. Tomorrow they would give me what I demanded because they had no choice. Tomorrow the Pacific Northwest Trauma Research Institute would be officially recognized as a partner in revolutionizing mental health treatment. Tomorrow my vindication would be complete. But today I had something even more valuable than revenge. Today I had the quiet satisfaction of knowing that sometimes the people who try to bury you are actually just planting the seeds of your greatest triumph. The Blue Star Coffee on Hawthorne Boulevard had become my unofficial office during the months when I couldn't afford proper workspace. 2 years ago, I spent countless hours at the corner table near the window, laptop open, building what would become the Pacific Northwest Trauma Research Institute from nothing more than determination and a desire to prove them wrong. The baristas knew my order by heart, the Wi-Fi password was burned into my memory, and the gentle hum of conversation had become the soundtrack to my resurrection. Today I sat in that same corner, watching Jessica Chen approach through the afternoon crowd. She looked nervous, constantly checking over her shoulder as if she expected Dr. Hayes or one of his allies to materialize from behind the coffee counter. Her usually perfect professional demeanor was cracked around the edges, revealing the stress of living with secrets that could destroy careers and reputations. Jessica slid into the seat across from me, declining my offer to buy her coffee with a shake of her head. Her hands were trembling slightly as she placed a manila envelope on the scarred wooden table between us. The envelope was thick, bulging with what I already knew would be the final pieces of evidence I needed to complete the picture of corruption that had been 3 years in the making. "I never thought it would go this far," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the espresso machine's steady grind. "When I first started noticing the irregularities, I thought maybe it was just sloppy record keeping. Administrative errors. I never imagined it was intentional." I reached for the envelope, but didn't open it immediately. Jessica had been taking enormous risks to help me gather this evidence, and I knew that every document she provided could potentially end her career if discovered. The board's investigation practices were secretive and punitive, designed to protect the institution rather than uncover truth. Anyone caught providing information to someone like me would face immediate termination and professional destruction. Tell me about the patterns you discovered, I said, keeping my voice gentle and encouraging. 3 years of conducting therapy had taught me how to create safe spaces for people to share difficult truths, and those skills were serving me well in this very different kind of conversation. Jessica opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of photocopied documents, spreading them across the table with the careful precision of someone who had organized evidence for a living. The papers were case files, disciplinary hearing transcripts, and internal communications that painted a disturbing picture of how the Oregon State Psychology Licensing Board actually operated behind its facade of professional ethics. It started with the billing audits, she explained, pointing to a spreadsheet that showed patterns of insurance claims submitted by various practitioners. Hayes's practice as part of routine compliance monitoring. When I noticed sessions being billed for times when his calendar showed he was attending conferences out of state. At first I thought it might be a clerical error, maybe his office manager mixing up dates or billing codes. She flipped to another document, a series of insurance claims that showed sessions allegedly conducted on consecutive days when Dr. Hayes's credit card records placed him in San Francisco attending a psychology conference. The discrepancies were obvious once you knew to look for them, but they had been buried in thousands of pages of routine billing data that no one had bothered to cross-reference. When I brought the irregularities to his attention privately, he became defensive immediately. He claimed the billing was handled by his office staff, and that any errors were unintentional. He asked me not to make an official report until he could investigate internally and provide explanations. I studied the documents while Jessica continued her story, noting how the fraudulent billing had escalated over time. What started as occasional phantom sessions had grown into a systematic scheme involving hundreds of false claims worth tens of thousands of dollars. Dr. Hayes had grown bold in his corruption, apparently confident that his position on the licensing board provided adequate protection from scrutiny. That's when I started looking at other board members' practices, Jessica continued, her voice growing stronger as she moved deeper into her revelations. Hayes was comfortable committing fraud while serving on the licensing board. I wondered what else might be happening under our oversight. The next set of documents revealed Dr. Amanda Foster's scheme involving her husband's pharmaceutical consulting company. Foster had been systematically referring patients to psychiatrists who had financial relationships with her husband's firm, creating a pipeline that generated kickbacks disguised as consulting fees. The referral patterns were subtle but unmistakable once mapped out over time, showing how Foster had steered vulnerable patients toward expensive medication regimens that benefited her family financially. Dr. Foster was more sophisticated about covering her tracks, Jessica explained, pointing to communication records that showed how the referrals were made through seemingly innocent professional networking. She would recommend colleagues for complex cases, emphasizing their expertise with particular medications. The patients received competent care, so no one was harmed directly, but the ethical violations were clear once you understood the financial relationships involved. I felt a familiar anger building as I reviewed the evidence of how Foster had exploited her position for personal gain. The patients she referred were often trauma survivors who trusted her judgment completely, people who had been wounded by previous betrayals and were particularly vulnerable to exploitation. The fact that they received adequate care didn't diminish the fundamental violation of using their suffering to generate profit. What about Dr. Torres? I asked, already suspecting that the university department head had his own secrets to hide. Jessica's expression darkened as she pulled out another section of documents. Dr. Michael Torres had been running a more complex scheme involving research grants and graduate student labor. He had been submitting grant applications using data and methodologies developed by his students, then publishing the results under his own name while claiming credit for work he hadn't actually performed. The university grants were substantial, Jessica explained, showing me funding records that totaled nearly $500,000 over 3 years. Torres was essentially operating a research mill using unpaid graduate students to produce publishable work that enhanced his reputation and brought in additional funding. The students received minimal credit while he built an academic career on their efforts. The documentation was extensive, including email exchanges where Torres explicitly instructed students to exclude their names from conference presentations and journal submissions. Some of the students had complained to university administrators, but their concerns had been dismissed as normal academic hierarchies rather than investigated as potential exploitation. "This is how they operate," I said, more to myself than to Jessica. "They create systems that protect themselves while exploiting everyone around them. Students, patients, even their own staff members become resources to be used rather than people to be served." Jessica nodded grimly, gathering the documents back into organized stacks. When I realized the scope of what was happening, I knew I had to do something, but I also knew that reporting through official channels would be useless. They control the investigation process, they write the reports, and they determine what constitutes sufficient evidence for disciplinary action. I understood her dilemma perfectly. The same system that had been used to destroy my career based on fabricated evidence was designed to protect its own members from accountability for actual misconduct. The board's processes created an appearance of thorough investigation, while ensuring that real threats to their authority were neutralized quickly and quietly. "That's when I started researching your case more carefully," Jessica continued. "The original evidence against you had always bothered me because it was so different from the patterns I typically saw in legitimate misconduct cases. Therapists who violate boundaries usually show escalating behavior over time, multiple complaints, obvious red flags that colleagues notice and report." She pulled out my original case file, a document I hadn't seen since my disciplinary hearing 3 years ago. Reading through the accusations again brought back the sick feeling of helplessness I had experienced when my professional world collapsed around me. The allegations were serious and specific, describing a pattern of secretly recording sessions and using the recordings for unauthorized research purposes. "Your case was clean," Jessica said, pointing to the timeline of the investigation. "Single complaint, single source of evidence, no corroborating witnesses or supporting documentation. The investigation was completed in 2 weeks, which is unusually fast for cases involving this level of misconduct. Most complex ethics violations take months to investigate properly." I remembered the rushed nature of my hearing, how Dr. Hayes had seemed eager to conclude the proceedings as quickly as possible. At the time, I had assumed they were simply efficient in their processing of clear-cut cases. Now I understood that speed had been necessary to prevent deeper scrutiny of evidence that wouldn't withstand careful examination. "The audio recordings were the smoking gun," Jessica continued, referring to the fabricated evidence that had sealed my fate. "They seemed conclusive because they contained your voice clearly identifying patients and discussing treatment details that only you would know. But the technology for creating convincing deepfake audio was advancing rapidly 3 years ago, and someone with access to your therapy session notes could have generated realistic fake recordings." She showed me technical analysis reports that I had commissioned privately using the small inheritance from my grandmother that had funded my initial investigation. The forensic audio experts had identified subtle digital artifacts in the recordings that indicated artificial generation rather than authentic capture. The evidence was definitive but had come too late to influence my original hearing. "Dr. Hayes had access to your session notes through his administrative privileges," Jessica explained, showing me system access logs that documented his unusual pattern of reviewing files from cases outside his direct supervision. "He downloaded your patient records 2 weeks before the complaint was filed, claiming he needed them for a routine audit of trauma therapy protocols." The picture was becoming clear now, a deliberate campaign to eliminate someone who had become inconvenient. My questions about billing irregularities had threatened to expose a system of corruption that extended throughout the board's leadership. Rather than address the problems I had identified, they had chosen to destroy my credibility and remove me from the profession entirely. "What I don't understand," I said, studying the timeline of events, "is why they didn't just transfer me to a different facility or find some other way to silence my concerns. Character assassination seems like an extreme response to routine questions about billing practices." Jessica hesitated, then pulled out one final document that she had kept separate from the others. It was a communication from the State Insurance Fraud Investigation Unit, dated 6 months before my license was revoked. The document showed that my questions about Dr. Hayes's billing had triggered an automatic flag in the insurance company's fraud detection system, generating an official inquiry that could have led to criminal charges. "Your complaint started a chain reaction that they couldn't control through normal channels," Jessica explained. "The insurance company's investigation was independent of the licensing board's authority. They couldn't simply dismiss the concerns or redirect the inquiry. If the fraud investigation had proceeded, it would have exposed not just Dr. Hayes but the entire network of corruption within the board." I stared at the document, finally understanding the full scope of what had been at stake 3 years ago. My destruction hadn't been petty revenge or professional jealousy. It had been a calculated move to prevent criminal prosecution and preserve a lucrative system of exploitation that benefited all the board's leadership. They needed to discredit you completely, Jessica continued, to ensure that anything you said about billing irregularities would be dismissed as the desperate accusations of someone who had already been proven unethical. If you had no credibility left in the profession, your observations about their practices would carry no weight with investigators. The coffee shop around us had grown quieter as the afternoon crowd thinned out, leaving us with more privacy to discuss the explosive evidence spread across our table. I felt a strange combination of vindication and disgust as I processed the full extent of their betrayal. My instincts about their corruption had been accurate, but the price of being right had been higher than I could have imagined. "There's something else," Jessica said, her voice dropping to nearly a whisper. "The Pacific Northwest Trauma Research Institute that you built has been under surveillance by the board for the past 18 months. They've been monitoring your activities, trying to find evidence of unauthorized practice or ethics violations that they could use to justify additional sanctions." She showed me surveillance reports that documented my movements, financial records that tracked my funding sources, and communication intercepts that revealed how closely they had been watching my reconstruction efforts. The level of attention was extraordinary, suggesting they viewed my success as a genuine threat to their continued authority. "They know about your federal funding, your research partnerships, and your training programs," Jessica continued. "What they don't know is that you've been gathering evidence against them, or that you've discovered the truth about your original case. They think they're still in control of the narrative." I gathered the documents carefully, understanding that Jessica had just handed me everything I needed to complete my vindication and their destruction. The evidence was comprehensive, damning, and documented through official channels that would be impossible for them to dismiss or discredit. Tomorrow's confrontation would be decisive because I now held proof of crimes that could result in prison sentences rather than merely professional discipline. "Why are you helping me?" I asked Jessica as we prepared to leave the coffee shop. "You could lose everything if they discover what you've done." She smiled sadly, closing her tablet and gathering her own materials. "Because I became a board investigator to protect the public from unethical practitioners. Instead, I discovered that I was working for unethical practitioners who were using my investigations to protect themselves from accountability. I can't fix the system from inside it, but maybe I can help someone who has the power to fix it from outside." We left the coffee shop separately, Jessica heading back to the Morrison Building to maintain her cover while I drove to my apartment in Southeast Portland to prepare for tomorrow's final confrontation. The evidence she had provided would transform my planned presentation from a negotiation into an ultimatum backed by the full force of federal law. That evening, I spread all the documents across my dining room table, organizing them into a comprehensive case that would expose 3 years of systematic corruption. The audio analysis reports that proved my innocence. The billing records that documented Dr. Hayes's fraud. The referral patterns that revealed Dr. Foster's kickback scheme. The grant applications that showed Dr. Torres' academic theft. The surveillance reports that demonstrated their continued harassment of someone they had already destroyed professionally. My laptop displayed the PowerPoint presentation I had been refining for weeks, each slide carefully crafted to maximize the impact of revelations that would transform tomorrow's meeting from a routine consultation into a reckoning that would reshape Oregon's mental health oversight system. The federal funding that they desperately needed would become the leverage that forced them to confront consequences they had avoided for years. I thought about the patients who had been exploited by Foster's referral schemes, the graduate students whose work had been stolen by Torres, the insurance companies that had been defrauded by Hayes's billing practices. My own destruction had been just one piece of a larger pattern of abuse that had continued unchecked because the people responsible for oversight were the same people committing the violations. Tomorrow that pattern would finally be broken. Tomorrow the Pacific Northwest Trauma Research Institute would emerge from the shadows to claim its rightful place as a leader in ethical mental health treatment. Tomorrow the people who had tried to bury me would discover that they had actually planted the seeds of their own accountability. The city lights outside my window painted Portland in soft gold and silver, the same view I had stared at during the darkest months after my license was revoked. Back then, I had wondered if I would ever work as a therapist again, if the research institute I was building would ever amount to more than elaborate self-therapy for someone who couldn't accept defeat. Now I knew that everything I had built was leading to this moment, this opportunity to transform personal vindication into systemic change that would protect future victims from the corruption I had endured. I closed my laptop and gathered the evidence into secure folders, double-checking that everything was properly organized for tomorrow's presentation. The woman who walked into that hearing 3 years ago had been naive enough to believe that truth and good intentions were adequate protection against institutional corruption. The woman who would walk into tomorrow's meeting understood that real change required not just moral authority, but the kind of irrefutable evidence that made resistance impossible. Jessica Chen had given me the tools to complete my vindication. Now it was time to use them. The elevator to the 15th floor seemed slower than usual the next morning, each floor marking another step toward a confrontation that would either vindicate everything I had built or destroy what remained of my professional future. I carried 3 separate briefcases, each containing different aspects of the evidence that would transform today's meeting from a routine consultation into a comprehensive exposure of institutional corruption. The weight of the documentation felt appropriate, given that I was literally carrying the proof that would topple a system that had operated without accountability for years. Hayes had scheduled the meeting for 9:30, claiming that the earlier time would allow for a more thorough discussion of the state's mental health initiative. What he didn't realize was that Jessica Chen had already informed me about the emergency board session they had convened at 8 that morning, a desperate attempt to develop strategies for managing what they perceived as a threat to their authority. They knew something was wrong, but they had no idea how comprehensively their secrets had been exposed. The reception area outside the boardroom was bustling with unusual activity when I arrived. Administrative staff hurried back and forth carrying files and documents, their expressions tense with the kind of urgency that suggested crisis management rather than routine preparation. Dr. Foster stood near the window, speaking in hushed tones with someone I recognized as the board's legal counsel, a sharp-faced woman, whose presence confirmed that they were anticipating serious challenges to their authority. Dr. Torres was pacing near the conference room doors, his usual academic composure replaced by nervous energy that manifested in constant checking of his phone and adjusting of his tie. The man who normally projected scholarly confidence looked like someone preparing for an examination he knew he was destined to fail. His pacing pattern had worn a subtle path in the expensive carpet, evidence of how long he had been wrestling with anxiety about the morning's proceedings. Jessica Chen emerged from the boardroom as I approached, carrying a tablet and wearing the carefully neutral expression she had perfected during our months of secret collaboration. Our eyes met briefly, and I caught the slight nod that confirmed everything was proceeding according to the plan we had developed during countless clandestine meetings. She had positioned herself perfectly to observe and document whatever unfolded, ensuring that today's revelations would be preserved in official records that couldn't be suppressed or altered. "Dr. Mitchell," she said, with professional courtesy that masked the significance of our relationship. "The board is ready for your presentation. I should mention that they've invited additional observers today, given the importance of the state mental health initiative we'll be discussing." The additional observers turned out to be representatives from the Oregon State Mental Health Division, the federal funding agency overseeing trauma research grants, and a delegation from the University of Oregon's Psychology Department. Their presence meant that today's revelations would have immediate consequences beyond the licensing board's internal politics. Whatever happened in the next few hours would be witnessed by exactly the people who had the authority to act on the evidence I was about to present. I entered the boardroom to find Dr. Hayes positioned at the head of the table with an air of forced confidence that couldn't quite mask his underlying nervousness. He had arranged the seating to place himself in the position of maximum authority, with board members flanking him and the outside observers relegated to chairs along the wall. The setup was designed to reinforce his control over the proceedings, but I recognized it as the defensive posturing of someone who sensed his authority was about to be challenged. "Mitchell," he began with the same patronizing tone he had used during my disciplinary hearing 3 years ago, "we appreciate you taking the time to discuss the Pacific Northwest Trauma Research Institute's potential involvement in our state initiative. We've reviewed the preliminary information about your organization's work, and we have several questions about your methodologies and oversight practices." The phrasing was carefully chosen to position him as the evaluator, and me as the supplicant, a dynamic that had worked to devastating effect during my license revocation hearing. But the woman sitting across from him today was not the same person who had been destroyed by his manipulation 3 years ago. The woman facing him now had spent 36 months building something more powerful than anything he controlled, and she had come prepared to demonstrate exactly how thoroughly the balance of power had shifted. "Of course," I replied smoothly, setting my first briefcase on the table and opening it with deliberate ceremony. I think the best way to address your questions about oversight and methodology is to begin with a comprehensive review of how research ethics are actually practiced in Oregon's mental health community. I connected my laptop to the room's presentation system, watching as the screen behind me displayed the Pacific Northwest Trauma Research Institute's logo alongside a subtitle that made several board members visibly uncomfortable. Ethical Innovation in Mental Health Research, Lessons from Systematic Corruption. The subtitle lingered on screen just long enough for everyone to read it twice, ensuring that the outside observers understood they were about to witness something far more significant than a routine consultation. Dr. Hayes leaned forward in his chair, his forced confidence beginning to crack around the edges. Dr. Mitchell, I'm not sure that subtitle is appropriate for today's discussion. We're here to evaluate your research protocols, not to revisit past disciplinary matters. You're absolutely right, I agreed, advancing to the next slide. We are here to evaluate research protocols. Specifically, we're here to evaluate the protocols that have been used by members of this board to conduct unauthorized research, manipulate data, and exploit vulnerable populations for personal gain. The room went silent, except for the quiet hum of the air conditioning system. Dr. Foster stopped whispering to the legal counsel and turned to stare at the screen, where a detailed timeline of her referral patterns was beginning to appear. Dr. Torres abandoned his phone entirely, his academic training apparently providing him with enough analytical skill to recognize that he was looking at a forensic dissection of his own misconduct. The first section of my presentation focused on Dr. Hayes's billing fraud, complete with insurance records that documented the phantom sessions and calendar data that proved his alibis. The evidence was presented with the same methodical precision I had learned during my graduate training in research methodology, each data point building toward conclusions that were mathematically inevitable, rather than subjectively arguable. Over the past 4 years, I explained, clicking through slides that showed the escalation of fraudulent billing. Dr. Hayes has submitted claims for approximately 340 sessions that never occurred, generating roughly $87,000 in fraudulent revenue. The pattern is consistent and systematic, indicating deliberate rather than accidental misconduct. Dr. Hayes shot to his feet, his face flushed with the kind of anger that springs from panic rather than righteousness. This is outrageous. You can't come in here and make these kinds of accusations without proper evidence or due process. I paused the presentation and opened my second briefcase, removing a thick folder of documents that I placed on the table with a soft thud that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. You're absolutely right about due process, Dr. Hayes. That's why I've spent the past 18 months working with forensic accountants, insurance investigators, and federal auditors to ensure that every piece of evidence meets the highest standards for criminal prosecution. The phrase criminal prosecution hung in the air like a physical presence, transforming the atmosphere from professional tension to genuine fear. The outside observers were leaning forward now, clearly recognizing that they were witnessing something far more serious than administrative discipline. The representative from the federal funding agency was taking notes, probably already calculating the compliance implications of what she was hearing. I resumed the presentation, moving to Dr. Foster's kickback scheme with the same methodical approach I had used to expose Dr. Hayes's fraud. The referral patterns were mapped out chronologically, showing how patients with specific insurance coverages were systematically directed towards psychiatrists who had financial relationships with her husband's consulting firm. The documentation included email exchanges that explicitly discussed the financial benefits of particular referral decisions. Foster's referral network generated approximately $43,000 in consulting fees for her husband's firm over a 2-year period. I continued, watching as the legal counsel frantically scribbled notes on a legal pad. The patients involved were primarily trauma survivors whose vulnerability made them particularly susceptible to exploitation through trusted professional relationships. Dr. Foster found her voice first, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Those referrals were made based on clinical expertise and patient needs. The financial relationships were properly disclosed according to professional standards. I clicked to the next slide, revealing communication records that showed the financial relationships had not been disclosed to patients and that referral decisions had been explicitly coordinated with her husband's business development efforts. The evidence was comprehensive enough to support not just professional discipline but civil lawsuits from patients who had been exploited through fraudulent referrals. The presentation continued with Dr. Torres's academic theft, documented through grant applications that claimed credit for research conducted by graduate students. The evidence included email exchanges where Torres explicitly instructed students to exclude their names from publications and conference presentations, along with university records that showed how the stolen research had advanced his career and secured additional funding. Dr. Torres has built his academic reputation on approximately $200,000 worth of research conducted by unpaid graduate students, I explained, displaying publication records that showed the systematic attribution of student work to his sole authorship. The grant funding he obtained through this fraudulent research has been used to expand programs that continue exploiting student labor while generating prestige for his personal career advancement. Each revelation was more damaging than the last, building a comprehensive picture of institutional corruption that extended far beyond simple ethical lapses into criminal territory. The outside observers were exchanging glances that suggested they were already planning the investigations and disciplinary actions that would follow today's presentation. The University of Oregon representatives looked particularly grim as they processed the implications of Dr. Torres' academic fraud for their institution's reputation. But it was the final section of my presentation that delivered the most devastating blow to their remaining credibility. I opened my third briefcase and removed the audio analysis reports that proved my original recordings had been artificially generated, along with the surveillance documents that showed their continued harassment of someone they had already destroyed professionally. 3 years ago, this board revoked my license based on fabricated evidence created using artificial intelligence technology, I said, displaying the forensic reports that definitively proved the recordings were fake. The fabrication was sophisticated enough to fool initial analysis but crude enough to be exposed through proper forensic examination. I let that revelation settle over the room before continuing with the surveillance reports that documented their obsessive monitoring of my activities since the license revocation. The level of attention was extraordinary, suggesting they had viewed my professional reconstruction as a genuine threat that required constant vigilance and potential sabotage. For the past 18 months, this board has used official resources to conduct unauthorized surveillance of a private citizen who posed no threat to public safety. I continued, showing records of financial monitoring, communication interception, and movement tracking that would have been illegal if conducted by anyone without proper legal authority. The legal counsel was writing furiously now, probably calculating the civil rights violations and potential lawsuits that would result from the illegal surveillance campaign. The federal representatives were conferring in whispers that suggested they were already planning to distance their agency from any association with the corrupt board members. Dr. Hayes had sunk back into his chair, the fight gone out of him as the full scope of his exposure became clear. Dr. Foster was staring at the financial projections showing how much money the Pacific Northwest Trauma Research Institute controlled, her business mind clearly calculating the impossibility of fighting someone who held both moral authority and economic leverage. Dr. Torres was typing frantically on his laptop, probably researching legal representation or resignation procedures. The Pacific Northwest Trauma Research Institute has been invited to lead a national initiative for trauma treatment innovation, I announced, clicking to display official correspondence from federal agencies and academic institutions. The initiative includes $4 million in additional funding and partnerships with research universities across the country. I paused to let the financial implications sink in before delivering the final blow. All of these opportunities require partnership with state licensing boards that demonstrate ethical leadership and transparent oversight. The federal government has made it clear that funding will be withdrawn from any state whose licensing practices fail to meet the highest standards of professional integrity. The ultimatum was clear without being explicitly stated. The board could cooperate with my vindication and reform their practices, or they could lose access to the federal funding that represented the future of mental health treatment in Oregon. The choice was between acknowledging their corruption and accepting accountability, or watching their authority crumble as federal agencies withdrew support for a system that could not be trusted to police itself. Jessica Chen cleared her throat softly, drawing attention to the official records she had been maintaining throughout the presentation. Her role as board investigator gave her documentation extraordinary legal weight, transforming today's revelations from mere accusations into official evidence that would be preserved in permanent records accessible to law enforcement and regulatory agencies. Based on the evidence presented today, she said with careful professional neutrality that masked her personal satisfaction, I believe the board should consider immediate measures to address the serious allegations that have been raised. The scope and severity of the documented misconduct appear to warrant not just internal discipline but coordination with external law enforcement agencies. The phrase law enforcement agencies completed the transformation of today's meeting from professional consultation to criminal exposure. The outside observers were already planning their exit strategies, clearly recognizing that association with the corrupt board members would damage their own institutions' reputations. The University of Oregon representatives were whispering about emergency faculty meetings and disciplinary procedures. Dr. Hayes finally found his voice, though it came out cracked and defeated. "What do you want from us, Dr. Mitchell?" I smiled with the same calm confidence I had cultivated during 36 months of careful planning and evidence gathering. "I want my license reinstated with a full public acknowledgement that the original charges were false. I want independent oversight implemented to prevent future corruption. I want the victims of your various schemes to receive appropriate compensation and support." I clicked to the final slide, revealing the two paths forward that would determine not just their immediate fate but the future of mental health oversight in Oregon. "And I want your decision today, because the federal announcement about expanded trauma research funding is scheduled for tomorrow morning at 10. The silence that followed was different from the shocked quiet that had greeted my earlier revelations. This was the desperate silence of people who finally understood that their survival depended entirely on the mercy of someone they had tried to destroy. The morning light streaming through the conference room windows seemed brighter now, illuminating faces that were beginning to grasp the full scope of their mistake and the complete reversal of power that had taken place over the past hour. The woman they had dismissed as a troublemaker had become the architect of their accountability. The evidence they thought they had buried had been meticulously documented and preserved. The system they had used to protect themselves from consequences had been turned into the mechanism of their exposure and defeat. Tomorrow, the Pacific Northwest Trauma Research Institute would
Emerge from the shadows to claim its rightful place as a leader in ethical mental health treatment. Tomorrow, federal funding would flow to institutions that demonstrated genuine commitment to professional integrity. Tomorrow, the people who had tried to bury me would discover that they had actually planted the seeds of a more just and accountable system. But today I had something even more valuable than vindication. Today I had the quiet satisfaction of watching institutional corruption collapse under the weight of irrefutable evidence and moral authority that could not be dismissed or discredited. The federal representative from the Department of Health and Human Services stood first, her movement cutting through the stunned silence like a blade through fabric. Margaret Walsh had been taking notes throughout my presentation, but now she closed her portfolio with the decisive snap of someone who had seen enough evidence to make irrevocable decisions. Her presence at today's meeting had been requested by the Oregon State Mental Health Division as part of their due diligence for the expanded trauma research funding, but she was about to become something far more significant than a routine observer. "Dr. Mitchell," she said, her voice carrying the authority of federal oversight that could make or break entire state programs, "I need to clarify the timeline for federal funding decisions. The announcement scheduled for tomorrow morning will determine which states receive continued support for mental health initiatives. Based on what I've witnessed today, I have serious concerns about Oregon's eligibility for federal partnership." Her words transformed the already tense atmosphere into something approaching panic. Dr. Hayes gripped the armrest of his chair so tightly his knuckles had gone white, while Dr. Foster exchanged desperate glances with the board's legal counsel. The $4 million in federal funding I had mentioned was not just an opportunity for expansion, it was the lifeline that would keep Oregon's public mental health system from complete collapse in the face of ongoing budget crises. "Miss Walsh," Dr. Hayes managed, his voice strained with the effort of maintaining professional composure while his world crumbled around him. "I think there may be some misunderstanding about the nature of today's allegations. Dr. Mitchell was dismissed from practice 3 years ago for serious ethical violations, and her current accusations appear to be motivated by personal grievance rather than factual evidence." Margaret Walsh consulted her notes with the methodical precision of someone whose recommendations would be reviewed by congressional oversight committees. "Dr. Hayes, the evidence Dr. Mitchell has presented includes forensic analysis reports from federal laboratories, insurance fraud documentation that has been verified by multiple agencies, and surveillance records that appear to violate several federal statutes regarding civil rights and privacy protection." She paused to allow the implications to settle before continuing with the kind of bureaucratic finality that ends careers and reshapes entire systems. "The Department of Health and Human Services cannot partner with state agencies that demonstrate systematic corruption or that target whistleblowers for professional retaliation. The evidence presented today suggests both patterns are present in Oregon's licensing board oversight. Dr. Torres found his voice, though it emerged as barely more than a desperate whisper. Surely there must be some process for addressing these concerns through proper channels before federal funding decisions are made. The timeline you're suggesting seems precipitous given the complexity of the allegations involved. I had remained silent during this exchange, watching as the board members struggled to comprehend how completely their situation had deteriorated. But Dr. Torres's appeal to bureaucratic process provided the perfect opening for the revelation that would complete their understanding of just how thoroughly they had been outmaneuvered. Actually, I said, opening the final folder from my third briefcase, there has been a proper process. For the past 8 months, the Pacific Northwest Trauma Research Institute has been working directly with federal investigators to document and verify the evidence of corruption within Oregon's mental health oversight system. I placed a thick stack of official correspondence on the conference table, documents that bore the letterheads of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General, and the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Oregon. The sight of federal law enforcement letterheads sent a visible shockwave through the room, transforming what had been professional panic into genuine terror. The surveillance operation you've been conducting against me for the past 18 months was identified by federal authorities 6 months ago. I continued watching as Dr. Hayes's face went pale with the realization that his harassment campaign had been monitored by the same agencies now investigating his other crimes. Your activities triggered automatic flags in federal monitoring systems designed to identify civil rights violations and obstruction of justice. Jessica Chen had positioned herself perfectly to observe the board members' reactions, her official documentation ensuring that every moment of their collapse would be preserved in records that could be subpoenaed by federal prosecutors. Her careful neutrality was beginning to crack around the edges, revealing the satisfaction of someone who had spent months gathering evidence of institutional corruption while maintaining her cover as a loyal employee. The University of Oregon representatives were conferring in urgent whispers, clearly calculating the damage that Dr. Torres's academic fraud would inflict on their institution's reputation and federal research partnerships. The systematic theft of graduate student work wasn't just an ethical violation, it was the kind of research misconduct that could trigger university-wide investigations and result in the suspension of federal funding for entire departments. Dr. Amanda Foster finally broke her silence, her voice carrying the sharp edge of someone whose business instincts were beginning to override her panic. Dr. Mitchell, what exactly do you want from this board? Clearly you have significant leverage, but destroying our careers won't necessarily advance your professional interests or improve mental health services in Oregon. Her attempt to reframe the situation as a negotiation rather than an accountability proceeding revealed both her desperation and her fundamental misunderstanding of what was actually happening. The woman facing her across the conference table was not the same person who had been broken by their manipulation 3 years ago. The woman they were dealing with now had built something more powerful than their entire corrupt system, and she had come to offer them a choice between reform and complete destruction. What I want, I replied, standing to address the room with the kind of quiet authority that can only come from holding all the cards in a high-stakes confrontation, is for Oregon to have a mental health oversight system that actually serves the public instead of exploiting it. What I want is for vulnerable patients to receive ethical treatment instead of being used as revenue sources for fraudulent schemes. I clicked to a new slide that displayed the organizational structure of the reformed Pacific Northwest Trauma Research Institute, showing how ethical oversight and transparency would be built into every level of operation. The contrast with the current board's secretive and self-serving practices was obvious and intentional, designed to show exactly what accountable leadership looked like in practice. The Pacific Northwest Trauma Research Institute is prepared to partner with a reformed Oregon State Psychology Licensing Board to implement the most advanced trauma treatment protocols in the country, I continued. Displaying the scope of federal funding and research partnerships that would transform Oregon's mental health system. But that partnership requires genuine ethical leadership, not the performance of ethics designed to protect institutional corruption. Margaret Walsh was nodding approvingly as she reviewed the reform proposals displayed on screen. The federal government had been seeking exactly this kind of innovative partnership, but only with state agencies that could demonstrate genuine commitment to transparency and accountability. The evidence of systematic corruption I had presented made it impossible for federal agencies to continue their relationship with the current board structure. Dr. Mitchell's proposals align perfectly with federal requirements for state partnership, she said, consulting her notes one final time before delivering what amounted to an ultimatum from the United States government. The Department of Health and Human Services will recommend continued federal funding for Oregon only if the state implements immediate and comprehensive reforms to its mental health oversight system. The room fell silent as everyone processed the finality of that statement. Federal funding recommendations were not suggestions that could be debated or delayed, they were determinations that shaped the entire landscape of state mental health services. Without federal partnership, Oregon's public mental health system would collapse within months, leaving hundreds of thousands of vulnerable residents without access to essential treatment and support services. Dr. Hayes struggled to his feet, his usual commanding presence reduced to the defeated posture of someone who finally understood that he had no remaining options. Mitchell, if we were to consider the reforms you're proposing, what assurances would you provide that past mistakes wouldn't be used to destroy individual careers unnecessarily? His use of the phrase past mistakes to describe systematic criminal fraud revealed both his continued refusal to accept responsibility and his desperate hope that he might somehow negotiate his way out of the consequences he had earned. But the woman facing him had spent 3 years building the moral and legal authority to ensure that accountability would finally come to people who had avoided it for far too long. Dr. Hayes, I replied with the calm precision of someone who had anticipated this exact moment for months. The reforms I'm proposing include independent oversight, transparent investigation procedures, and victim compensation programs. Individual consequences will be determined by law enforcement agencies and professional ethics boards that operate without the conflicts of interest that have corrupted the current system. I paused to let that sink in before delivering the final element of my ultimatum. What I can assure you is that cooperation with reform efforts will be taken into consideration by federal prosecutors who are already reviewing the evidence of criminal activity that has been documented over the past 8 months. The phrase federal prosecutors completed the transformation of today's meeting from professional consultation to criminal exposure. The board members were no longer dealing with a disgruntled former colleague seeking personal vindication, they were facing federal law enforcement officials who had the authority to pursue criminal charges that could result in prison sentences and lifetime bans from professional practice. Jessica Chen cleared her throat softly, drawing attention to the official documentation she had been maintaining throughout the proceedings. As the board's chief investigator, I believe I should note that today's revelations require immediate implementation of emergency protocols for institutional integrity. The scope and severity of the documented misconduct appears to warrant suspension of normal board operations pending external investigation. Her carefully worded statement was actually a recommendation that the current board members be removed from authority immediately, preventing them from using their remaining time in office to destroy evidence or retaliate against witnesses. The suggestion carried enormous weight because it came from the person responsible for investigating professional misconduct, someone whose credibility within the system was unquestioned despite her secret collaboration with my investigation. The University of Oregon representatives stood almost simultaneously, clearly recognizing that their continued presence at this meeting would constitute tacit endorsement of the corruption that had been exposed. Dr. Sarah Chen, the psychology department chair, addressed the room with the kind of academic authority that carries weight in professional circles. The University of Oregon cannot continue its association with individuals who have demonstrated systematic violation of research ethics and academic integrity, she announced, her words effectively ending Dr. Torres's academic career regardless of any other consequences he might face. We will be conducting our own investigation into the research misconduct allegations and implementing immediate measures to protect our graduate students from exploitation. Her statement triggered a cascade of similar announcements from other observers who had witnessed today's revelations. The Oregon Psychological Association representative declared that membership reviews would be initiated immediately. The state mental health division official confirmed that all contracts with board members' private practices would be suspended pending investigation. Each announcement further isolated the corrupt board members from the professional networks that had enabled their misconduct. Foster made one final attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of her reputation, her voice carrying the desperation of someone who finally understood that her carefully constructed life was collapsing around her. Dr. Mitchell, surely there must be some way to address these concerns without destroying the careers of people who have dedicated their lives to mental health service. I looked at her across the conference table, remembering the woman who had sat in judgment of my fabricated misconduct 3 years ago, who had voted to destroy my career based on evidence she knew was questionable at best. The irony of her appeal for mercy was not lost on me, but it also provided the perfect opportunity to demonstrate the difference between justice and revenge. Foster, I said, my voice gentle but implacable, 3 years ago you had the opportunity to demand proper investigation of the evidence against me. You had the chance to question whether the charges were supported by facts rather than political convenience. You had the power to protect a colleague who was being targeted for asking legitimate questions about institutional corruption. I paused to let her remember her own choices before continuing with the kind of moral clarity that comes from having survived institutional betrayal and emerged stronger. You chose to protect the system instead of protecting the truth. You chose to enable corruption instead of confronting it. You chose to destroy someone who threatened your comfortable arrangements instead of examining whether those arrangements were ethical. The weight of her own history settled over Dr. Foster like a physical presence, and I watched as she finally began to understand that the consequences she was facing were not arbitrary punishment but the natural result of choices she had made repeatedly over many years. The system that had protected her from accountability was finally being dismantled by the very person it had tried to silence. Margaret Walsh gathered her materials and prepared to leave, her departure marking the end of any possibility that today's revelations could be contained or minimized. Federal agencies moved with their own timeline and authority, and her presence had transformed what might have been internal discipline into a matter of federal oversight that would reshape Oregon's entire mental health system. Dr. Mitchell, she said, extending her hand with the respect accorded to someone whose integrity had been validated by the highest levels of federal scrutiny, the Pacific Northwest Trauma Research Institute will receive full federal support for its expansion efforts. We look forward to partnering with ethical leadership that prioritizes patient welfare over institutional protection. Her handshake was firm and businesslike, the kind of professional acknowledgement that carries enormous weight in federal bureaucracy. The woman who had been dismissed as unfit for professional practice 3 years ago was now being recognized as a national leader in mental health innovation, her vindication complete and her authority unquestionable. The meeting dissolved into smaller conversations as participants processed the magnitude of what they had witnessed and began planning their responses to revelations that would reshape Oregon's mental health landscape. Federal investigators would be arriving within days to begin formal proceedings. University officials would be implementing emergency reforms to protect students and faculty from exploitation. Professional organizations would be reviewing membership standards and oversight procedures. But I remained seated at the conference table, surrounded by the evidence that had taken 3 years to gather and organize, watching as the people who had tried to destroy me grappled with the consequences of their own choices. The vindication was complete, but it felt different from what I had imagined during the darkest months after my license revocation. The satisfaction came not from their suffering but from knowing that the system would finally serve the people it was designed to protect. Jessica Chen approached as the room emptied, her official duties complete and her cover no longer necessary. "Congratulations," she said quietly, her voice carrying the relief of someone who had risked everything to ensure that truth finally prevailed over institutional corruption. "The system will be better because of what you've accomplished today." I gathered my materials slowly, taking time to process the complete transformation of my professional circumstances. 3 years ago, I had walked out of this building as a broken woman whose career had been destroyed by people who abused their authority to protect their secrets. Today I was leaving as the architect of institutional reform that would prevent other vulnerable professionals from experiencing the same betrayal. The elevator ride to the ground floor was silent, but it carried the weight of complete vindication and the promise of meaningful change. The Pacific Northwest Trauma Research Institute would emerge from the shadows to claim its rightful place as a leader in ethical mental health treatment. Federal funding would flow to institutions that demonstrated genuine commitment to transparency and accountability. The people who had tried to bury me had discovered that they had actually planted the seeds of their own accountability and the growth of something far more powerful than what they had tried to destroy. Outside the Morrison Building, Portland's afternoon sunlight painted the city in warm gold and deep shadows, the same light that had witnessed my destruction 3 years ago and was now illuminating my complete restoration. The woman who had been told she was unfit to practice psychology had become the person responsible for reforming the entire system of professional oversight in Oregon. Sometimes the people who try to silence you don't realize they're actually giving you the motivation to become louder than they ever imagined possible. Sometimes the institutions that protect corruption contain the seeds of their own reformation, waiting for someone with enough courage and persistence to nurture those seeds into accountability. Sometimes the best response to injustice isn't revenge but the patient construction of something so much better that the old system becomes obviously obsolete. 3 years ago, they had taken away my license to practice therapy. Today they had given me the authority to transform how therapy would be practiced throughout Oregon and beyond. The vindication was complete, but more importantly, the future was brighter for every vulnerable person who would benefit from ethical mental health treatment delivered by professionals who were accountable to the people they served rather than the institutions that employed them. 6 months later, I stood in the same 15th floor conference room where my professional destruction had been orchestrated 3 years ago and my vindication had been completed 6 months before. But today, the Morrison Building felt like an entirely different place. The oppressive atmosphere of institutional corruption had been replaced by the energy of genuine reform, and the people gathered around the polished mahogany table represented a new era of ethical leadership in Oregon's mental health system. The emergency restructuring had moved faster than anyone had anticipated. Within 2 weeks of my revelations, federal investigators had arrived with subpoenas and search warrants that uncovered even more extensive corruption than my investigation had revealed. Dr. Hayes had been arrested at his home office while attempting to destroy computer files containing additional evidence of insurance fraud. Dr. Foster had fled to her vacation home in Cabo San Lucas, only to be arrested by Mexican authorities at the request of U.S. Marshals. Torres had resigned from the university and entered plea negotiations before formal charges were even filed. The media coverage had been relentless and devastating. Emma Thompson from the Portland Tribune had broken the story with a front-page expose that detailed not just the specific crimes of the board members but the systematic failure of oversight that had allowed their corruption to flourish unchecked for years. The headline "Therapy for Corruption: How Oregon's Mental Health Watchdogs Became Predators" had become a nationally syndicated story that sparked similar investigations in 12 other states. But today's meeting wasn't about dwelling on the destruction of the old system. Today was about celebrating the birth of something unprecedented in American mental health oversight, a licensing board that operated with complete transparency, independent ethical review, and genuine accountability to the public it served. The Oregon State Psychology Licensing Board had been reconstituted from the ground up with new leadership selected through a process that included public input and federal oversight. Dr. Maria Santos, the new board chair, had flown in from her position as Director of Ethical Oversight at the American Psychological Association specifically to lead Oregon's reform effort. Her reputation for uncompromising integrity had made her the unanimous choice of federal officials who insisted that the new board must be above reproach in every aspect of its operation. She had spent the past 6 months implementing oversight procedures that exceeded federal requirements and established Oregon as a national model for ethical mental health governance. Dr. Mitchell, she said, gesturing toward the presentation screen where my license reinstatement ceremony was about to begin, it's difficult to overstate the significance of what you've accomplished. Not just for your own vindication but for the transformation of how professional oversight operates throughout the country. The ceremony itself was being broadcast live on the Oregon State Mental Health Division's website, ensuring that my restoration would be as public as my original destruction had been. Representatives from 14 states were observing the proceedings as part of their own reform efforts, and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services had sent a delegation to document best practices for national implementation. Margaret Walsh, who had become something of a mentor during the months of federal oversight, took the podium to address the significance of today's events for mental health policy nationwide. Her presence at the ceremony represented more than bureaucratic support. It symbolized the federal government's commitment to ensuring that what had happened in Oregon would never be repeated anywhere in the country. The case of Dr. Sarah Mitchell represents both the worst failure of professional oversight and the most inspiring example of individual courage in the face of institutional corruption. She began, her words carrying the weight of federal authority that had transformed my personal vindication into a matter of national policy. The Pacific Northwest Trauma Research Institute has become a model for how ethical leadership can emerge from the ruins of corrupt systems. I listened to her speech from my seat at the conference table, surrounded by the same view of the Willamette River that had witnessed my professional death and resurrection. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was being celebrated in the exact location where I had been condemned, but the symbolism felt appropriate. Transformation required returning to the scene of destruction and proving that something better could grow from its ashes. The financial impact of the corruption scandal had been staggering. Insurance companies had filed civil suits seeking recovery of millions of dollars in fraudulent claims. The University of Oregon faced federal investigation and potential loss of research funding due to Dr. Torres's academic misconduct. Patients who had been exploited through Dr. Foster's referral schemes were pursuing class action lawsuits that could bankrupt her family's consulting business. But the human cost had been even more significant. Dozens of mental health professionals had come forward to report their own experiences with board retaliation and corruption, revealing a pattern of abuse that extended back more than a decade. Graduate students exploited by Dr. Torres's research theft had filed formal complaints that resulted in university policy changes protecting student intellectual property. Patients victimized by the various schemes had received counseling and compensation through victim assistance programs funded by federal grants. Jessica Chen had been promoted to director of the new Independent Oversight Division, a position created specifically to ensure that investigative functions remained separate from board politics. Her courage in documenting the corruption and supporting my investigation had earned her recognition as a national expert in professional ethics enforcement. She had testified before congressional committees and consulted with licensing boards in 6 states implementing similar reforms. The Pacific Northwest Trauma Research Institute had grown beyond anything I had imagined during those desperate months when I was building it from the ruins of my destroyed career. Federal funding had expanded our operations to include satellite offices in Seattle, San Francisco, and Denver. Our treatment protocols were being implemented in veteran hospitals across the country, and medical schools were incorporating our research into their curricula for training the next generation of trauma specialists. Dr. David Park, my former colleague who had provided crucial early support during my investigation, had joined the institute as director of clinical training. His decision to leave his
secure university position to join our startup had been vindicated by our rapid growth and national recognition. Together, we had built something that combined cutting-edge research with uncompromising ethical standards, proving that professional success and moral integrity were not competing values but complementary strengths. The ceremony proceeded with the formal reading of my license reinstatement, a document that included an unprecedented public apology for the board's misconduct and acknowledgement that my original charges had been fabricated. The apology was more than symbolic. It established legal precedent that would protect other professionals from similar retaliation and provide grounds for civil litigation against corrupt oversight bodies. But the moment that meant the most to me was when Dr. Santos presented me with the newly created Oregon Award for Professional Courage, an honor that would be given annually to mental health professionals who demonstrated exceptional integrity in the face of institutional pressure. The award included a monetary prize funded by settlements from the corruption cases, but more importantly, it represented official recognition that challenging corruption was not just acceptable but essential to maintaining professional standards. Dr. Mitchell's experience demonstrates that sometimes the greatest service we can provide to our profession is refusing to remain silent when we witness misconduct, Dr. Santos said as she presented the award. Her investigation and advocacy have resulted in reforms that will protect patients and professionals for generations to come. The audience included many of the people who had supported me during the darkest period of my professional life. My parents had flown in from Seattle, their pride evident in faces that had shown such concern and confusion during the months when my career seemed permanently destroyed. Former colleagues who had risked their own positions to provide character testimony during my appeals process were present to witness my complete vindication. But perhaps the most meaningful presence was that of the graduate students and early career professionals who had been inspired by my story to pursue their own advocacy for ethical reform. Several had started organizations focused on protecting vulnerable professionals from institutional retaliation. Others had chosen research careers specifically to continue the work of developing ethical oversight systems that serve the public interest rather than protecting institutional authority. The media coverage of today's ceremony would reach far beyond Oregon's borders. National news organizations had picked up the story as an example of how individual courage could catalyze systemic change. Mental health advocacy groups were using my case to push for federal legislation that would standardize ethical oversight procedures and provide protection for professionals who reported misconduct. The broader implications were already becoming clear across multiple states. Licensing boards were implementing transparency requirements and independent oversight mechanisms. Professional associations were revising their ethics codes to include stronger protection for whistleblowers. Academic institutions were establishing clear policies protecting graduate students from exploitation and ensuring proper attribution of research contributions. After the formal ceremony concluded, I found myself standing at the conference room windows, looking out over Portland's downtown skyline while processing the complete transformation of my professional circumstances. 3 years ago, I had been a broken woman whose career had been destroyed by people who abused their authority to protect their secrets. Today I was recognized as a national leader whose advocacy had reformed an entire system of professional oversight. The Pacific Northwest Trauma Research Institute occupied 3 floors of a renovated warehouse in the Pearl District, our offices designed to reflect the values of transparency and collaboration that had guided our growth. Our staff had expanded to include 43 researchers, clinicians, and support personnel, all committed to advancing trauma treatment through ethical innovation and rigorous scientific methodology. Our patient outcomes continued to exceed national standards by significant margins. Veterans treated through our protocols showed 47% greater improvement in PTSD symptoms compared to traditional approaches. Abuse survivors participating in our programs demonstrated 33% lower rates of treatment dropout and substantially higher rates of long-term recovery. These results had attracted attention from medical institutions worldwide, leading to research partnerships that were expanding our impact globally. The federal funding that had been threatened during my confrontation with the corrupt board had not only been restored but significantly expanded. The Department of Health and Human Services had designated our institute as a national center of excellence for trauma treatment research, providing ongoing funding that would support our operations for the next decade. Additional grants from private foundations and research institutions had created an endowment that ensured our long-term sustainability. But the personal satisfaction came not from the professional recognition or financial success, but from knowing that the system now served the people it was designed to protect. The new licensing board operated with complete transparency, publishing all investigation reports and maintaining public databases of disciplinary actions. Independent oversight ensured that personal or political considerations could not influence professional decisions. Victim support programs provided resources for professionals who experienced retaliation for reporting misconduct. The ripple effects continued to spread throughout the mental health profession. Medical schools were incorporating ethics training that emphasized the importance of challenging institutional corruption. Professional conferences featured sessions on protecting vulnerable colleagues from retaliation. Research institutions were implementing policies that ensured proper attribution of scholarly work and protected students from exploitation. My story had become a case study taught in ethics courses at universities across the country, demonstrating how individual courage could catalyze institutional reform. But more importantly, it had inspired a generation of mental health professionals to view ethical advocacy as an essential component of their professional responsibilities rather than an optional add-on to clinical practice. The evening reception following the ceremony took place at the Portland Art Museum, where colleagues and supporters gathered to celebrate not just my vindication but the broader transformation of Oregon's mental health oversight system. The conversation buzzed with excitement about future innovations and collaborative opportunities that would have been impossible under the corrupt previous regime. Dr. Santos approached me near the end of the reception, carrying a folder that contained the formal documentation of my license reinstatement along with the investigative reports that had cleared my name completely. Dr. Mitchell, she said, I want you to know that your case has fundamentally changed how licensing boards operate throughout the country. The reforms we've implemented here are being adopted in 17 states, and federal legislation is being drafted to mandate similar changes nationwide. I accepted the folder with a sense of completion that had been 3 years in the making. The documents represented more than personal vindication, they symbolized the transformation of a system that had prioritized institutional protection over public service. The woman who had been told she was unfit to practice psychology had become the architect of reforms that would protect countless future professionals from similar abuse. The final surprise of the evening came when Margaret Walsh announced that the federal government was creating a new position specifically focused on mental health ethics oversight, and that I was being offered the role of director. The position would involve coordinating ethical reform efforts across all 50 states, ensuring that the changes implemented in Oregon became the national standard for professional oversight. The offer represented an opportunity to expand my impact far beyond what I had accomplished through the Pacific Northwest Trauma Research Institute. Federal oversight would provide the authority and resources necessary to implement systemic changes that could prevent future cases of institutional corruption and professional retaliation. The position would allow me to ensure that no other mental health professional would experience the kind of betrayal that had nearly destroyed my career. As I considered the offer while driving home through Portland's quiet evening streets, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from professional destruction to national leadership in ethics reform. The woman who had been broken by institutional corruption had become stronger, more determined, and more effective than she ever could have been within the system that had tried to silence her. The apartment where I had spent so many dark months wondering if I would ever practice therapy again now felt like a launching pad for even greater impact. The walls that had witnessed my despair and determination were now celebrating my complete vindication and the promise of continued advocacy for ethical reform.
3 years ago, they had taken away my license to practice therapy, believing they could silence my questions about their corrupt practices. Tonight, I held not only my restored license but an invitation to lead national reform efforts that would transform how mental health oversight operated throughout the United States. The people who had tried to bury me had actually planted the seeds of the most comprehensive ethics reform in the profession's history. Sometimes the institutions that seem most powerful are actually the most fragile, dependent on secrecy and complicity to maintain their authority over people who could expose their corruption if they found the courage to speak truth to power. Sometimes the people who seem most vulnerable are actually the most dangerous to corrupt systems because they have nothing left to lose and everything to gain from demanding accountability. The vindication was complete, but more importantly, the future was brighter for every vulnerable professional who would benefit from ethical oversight systems that serve the public interest rather than protecting institutional authority. The woman they had dismissed as unfit for professional practice had become the architect of reforms that would protect the integrity of mental health treatment for generations to come. 2 years had passed since I accepted the position as Director of Mental Health Ethics Oversight for the Department of Health and Human Services, and the view from my office window in Washington, D.C. had become as familiar as the Portland skyline I had left behind. The cherry blossoms along the Potomac River were in full bloom, their delicate pink petals drifting past the glass as I reviewed the quarterly report documenting the nationwide implementation of ethical reform protocols that had originated from my confrontation with Oregon's corrupt licensing board. The numbers told a story of transformation that exceeded even my most optimistic projection. 47 states had implemented comprehensive oversight reforms modeled on Oregon's restructured system. Professional misconduct reports had increased by 312%, not because corruption had grown but because professionals finally felt safe reporting violations without fear of retaliation. Patient satisfaction scores had risen consistently across all metrics as mental health services became more transparent and accountable to the communities they served. My assistant knocked gently on the door, carrying a folder marked with the distinctive red classification stripe that indicated urgent federal business requiring immediate attention. The morning briefings had become routine over the past 2 years, but today's felt different, carrying a weight of significance that suggested major developments rather than standard administrative updates. Dr. Mitchell, she said, placing the folder on my desk with the careful precision of someone who understood that federal oversight documents could reshape entire professional landscapes. The Congressional Oversight Committee has requested your testimony regarding the proposed Mental Health Professional Protection Act. The hearing is scheduled for next Thursday. I opened the folder to find draft legislation that would establish federal standards for professional licensing boards nationwide, mandate independent oversight for all disciplinary proceedings, and create whistleblower protection programs for healthcare professionals who reported institutional misconduct. The bill represented the culmination of everything I had fought for since my license was first revoked, transforming personal vindication into systemic protection for vulnerable professionals throughout the country. The legislation had bipartisan support, unusual in an era of political polarization because the underlying principles transcended partisan boundaries. Conservative representatives appreciated the emphasis on accountability and fiscal responsibility that would eliminate fraud and waste in public mental health programs. Progressive legislators supported the patient protection elements and worker rights provisions that would shield vulnerable professionals from institutional retaliation. Senator Patricia Williams, who had been instrumental in drafting the legislation, had specifically requested my testimony because my case had become the exemplar for why federal oversight was necessary to protect both professionals and patients from corrupt local authorities. The transformation of Oregon's mental health system had been so successful that other states were voluntarily adopting similar reforms rather than waiting for federal mandates. The hearing would be televised nationally, providing a platform to share the lessons learned from my experience with an audience that included millions of mental health professionals who were still working within systems that prioritized institutional protection over ethical accountability. The opportunity to influence federal policy represented the logical culmination of a journey that had begun with simple questions about billing irregularities and had evolved into comprehensive reform of professional oversight nationwide. But before I could focus on congressional testimony, there was another matter requiring my immediate attention. The folder contained correspondence from the International Association of Psychology Licensing Boards, inviting me to keynote their annual conference in Geneva next month. Mental health oversight organizations from 37 countries were gathering to discuss implementing ethical reforms based on the American model that had emerged from Oregon's transformation. The international implications of my work had become apparent gradually as foreign delegations visited Washington to observe our oversight protocols in action. Countries throughout Europe, Asia, and South America were grappling with similar issues of professional corruption and institutional accountability, seeking proven solutions that could be adapted to their unique legal and cultural contexts. Dr. Elena Vasquez from Spain's National Psychology Council had been particularly interested in our whistleblower protection programs, explaining that Spanish mental health professionals faced severe retaliation for reporting misconduct but had no legal recourse for protection. The protocols we had developed in Oregon were being translated into multiple languages and adapted for international implementation through partnerships with the World Health Organization. My phone buzzed with a text message from Jessica Chen, who had become director of Oregon's Independent Ethics Oversight Division and remained one of my closest collaborators in advancing reform efforts. She was updating me on the latest developments in what had become known as the Cascade Effect, the ongoing discovery of corruption in licensing boards across the Pacific Northwest that could be traced back to the network that had originally targeted me for destruction. The investigations had revealed connections between corrupt board members in Oregon, Washington, and California, with evidence suggesting coordination of retaliation efforts against professionals who questioned unethical practices. Federal prosecutors were pursuing racketeering charges against 14 individuals whose activities had crossed state lines and involved systematic violation of civil rights protections for healthcare workers. The scope of the conspiracy had shocked even experienced federal investigators who were accustomed to uncovering complex criminal enterprises. The corrupt officials had maintained encrypted communication networks, shared databases of targeted professionals, and coordinated their responses to oversight efforts in ways that suggested extensive planning and organization rather than isolated incidents of misconduct. Hayes, the former Oregon board chairman who had orchestrated my destruction, had become a cooperating witness in exchange for a reduced sentence, providing detailed information about the network's operations that was enabling prosecutors to build cases against co-conspirators throughout the region. His testimony had revealed the systematic nature of the corruption and the sophisticated methods used to identify and eliminate threats to their authority. The personal cost of his cooperation had been substantial. His medical licenses had been permanently revoked in all states where he had practiced, his assets had been seized to pay restitution to victims of his various schemes, and his reputation had been so thoroughly destroyed that he would never work in healthcare again. The man who had wielded absolute authority over professional careers had been reduced to hoping that his cooperation might earn him early release from federal prison. Dr. Foster's situation had been even more dramatic. Her attempt to flee the country had resulted in additional charges for obstruction of justice and failure to appear, leading to a longer sentence than she would have received if she had remained to face the original allegations. The pharmaceutical consulting business that had generated her kickback income had been dissolved, its assets distributed to patient victims through a court-supervised restitution program. The international manhunt that had led to her capture in Mexico had generated significant media attention, particularly when investigators discovered that she had been planning to establish a new practice in Costa Rica using forged credentials and falsified background checks. The case had prompted international cooperation agreements designed to prevent corrupt healthcare professionals from simply relocating to countries with less stringent oversight. Dr. Torres had received the lightest sentence due to his immediate cooperation and voluntary resignation from the university, but his academic career had been permanently destroyed. The research theft that had built his reputation had been systematically exposed and retracted, with proper attribution restored to the graduate students whose work had been stolen. The University of Oregon had implemented comprehensive reforms to protect student intellectual property and ensure appropriate supervision of faculty research practices. The personal transformations were as significant as the institutional changes. Graduate students who had been exploited by Dr. Torres had gone on to successful independent careers, their restored research contributions earning them recognition and opportunities that had been previously denied. Several had chosen to specialize in research ethics and academic integrity, ensuring that future generations of students would be protected from similar exploitation. Patients who had been victimized by the various corruption schemes had received not just financial compensation but access to ethical treatment that addressed both their original mental health needs and the additional trauma caused by professional betrayal. The victim support programs had become models for therapeutic approaches to institutional abuse, providing frameworks that were being adopted by healthcare systems dealing with similar breaches of trust. My own journey had taken unexpected turns as the scope of my influence expanded beyond anything I had imagined during those desperate months when I was building the Pacific Northwest Trauma Research Institute from the ruins of my destroyed career. The institute continued to thrive under Dr. Park's leadership, having established itself as the premier research center for trauma treatment innovation while maintaining the ethical standards that had distinguished it from corrupt institutions. The federal position had provided opportunities to influence policy development at the highest levels of government, working directly with congressional leaders and executive branch officials to craft legislation that would protect healthcare professionals and patients throughout the country. The relationships I had built with federal investigators and oversight agencies had enabled comprehensive reforms that addressed not just mental health licensing but broader issues of professional accountability across all healthcare disciplines. The speaking engagements had multiplied as my story became a case study for institutional reform and individual courage in the face of systemic corruption. Universities invited me to address ethics courses, professional associations requested keynote presentations, and international organizations sought consultation on implementing transparency and accountability measures in their oversight systems. But perhaps the most meaningful aspect of my expanded role was the opportunity to mentor other professionals who were facing retaliation for reporting misconduct. The federal whistleblower protection programs I had helped design were providing real support for healthcare workers who found themselves targeted by corrupt institutions, ensuring that they had legal protection and financial resources necessary to survive while pursuing accountability. The evening reception at the German embassy marked the beginning of my preparation for the Geneva conference, where international delegates were gathering to discuss global implementation of ethical oversight reforms. The conversations buzzed with excitement about collaborative opportunities that would standardize professional accountability measures across national boundaries, creating international networks of support for healthcare workers who challenged institutional corruption. Ambassador Klaus Muller approached me near the conclusion of the reception, carrying documents that outlined the European Union's proposed Healthcare Ethics Directive, legislation that would establish uniform standards for professional oversight throughout all member countries. The directive was based largely on the American reforms that had emerged from Oregon's transformation, adapted for the different legal frameworks and cultural contexts of European healthcare systems. Dr. Mitchell, he said, your work has influenced policy discussions at the highest levels of European governance. The proposed directive represents the most comprehensive reform of healthcare oversight in the European Union's history, and it exists because of the precedent you established through your advocacy in Oregon. The recognition was gratifying, but more importantly, it represented validation that the principles of transparency and accountability could transcend national boundaries and cultural differences. The corrupt practices I had encountered in Oregon were not unique to American healthcare systems, and the solutions we had developed could be adapted to protect professionals and patients worldwide. As I reflected on the journey from professional destruction to international influence, I was struck by how the most devastating experience of my life had become the foundation for the most meaningful work I had ever undertaken. The woman who had been broken by institutional betrayal had become stronger, more determined, and more effective than she ever could have been within the system that had tried to silence her. The vindication was complete, but the work continued. Tomorrow I would begin preparing testimony that would influence federal legislation affecting millions of healthcare professionals. Next month I would address international delegates seeking to implement ethical reforms in their own countries. The following year would bring new opportunities to advance accountability and transparency in healthcare systems worldwide. The people who had tried to bury me had actually planted the seeds of the most comprehensive ethics reform in the profession's history. Their corruption had created the conditions for transformation that would protect countless future professionals from similar abuse. Sometimes the greatest service we can provide to our profession is refusing to remain silent when we witness misconduct, even when speaking truth to power comes at enormous personal cost. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.